Hey, so before this story begins, this is my first time talking to you before a story starts. I usually don't want to interrupt, but before this story begins, this story is an anthology. So it's three parts, and they all relate to each other. However, the story, there are three different stories, and again, they all relate to each other. It's written by Caleb M. Foster. It's available for free on Amazon if you'd like to read it. I'm going to leave all the links in the description. Thank you to Caleb for letting me read it. So this is Chills from the Hills. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Ego, Volt, Anima, Vestra. It appeared just after sunset, as darkness began to permeate the woods around my family's hunting cabin. I wouldn't have seen it in time if it weren't for the silver beams emanating from the full moon, which streamed into the clearing around the cabin and bathed the ground in their pale brilliance. I'd finally arrived at the cabin. Dusk had given way to the night so that darkness could reign. I was exhausted from a full day of work and the long drive, trying my best to relax, when I realized that I had forgotten to bring my rifle in with me. I groaned, irritated with myself, then forced myself to get out of the old 70s floral print armchair and drag myself to the door. I groggily stepped out into the moonlight, leaving the door wide open. I was immediately overtaken by the urge to yawn and stretch as far as I could, to the point that I nearly lost my balance. It wasn't until I regained my composure and began to walk over to my pickup truck that I became aware of how eerily calm and quiet the woods around me had become. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I knew from experience that this was never a good combination when one was in the mountains by themselves. So I upped my pace. I closed the rest of the distance as quickly and as quietly as I could. My eyes searched the edge of the woods for any movement or any sign that something may be there. Upon reaching my truck, I stood still for a moment, then looked around and listened intently before I pulled the passenger side door open. Believing that the coast was clear, I stepped up onto the sidebar and reached up into the back seat for my gun case. I then felt a piercing gaze fall upon my back and grabbed onto the seat before I slowly turned myself around. That's when I saw it. Peeking around from the back corner of the cabin was what appeared to be the head of some sort of canine. The only feature that I could make out for certain at that moment was its shimmering red eyes, locked onto mine. I froze in place, unblinking, and felt a wave of tension and anxiety wash over me. I didn't dare move, lest it would approach me. It looked over toward the trees, then back at me before it slowly came out from behind the cabin and moved out into the clearing, perpendicular to my position. Now that it was out in the open, I could see that this was in fact a dog, but it was no ordinary dog. It was massive, and even in the light it was still completely encompassed by shadow, as if it were made of the darkness that surrounded us. Its body emitted what could only be likened to an aura of blackness, animated with fluttering tufts that vaguely resembled flames. I'd never seen anything like it, and the sight sent such intense shivers down my spine that it caused me to arch my back slightly out of reflex. I knew exactly what it was doing, sizing me up. I slowly reached my hand down to my hip where I usually keep my sidearm, realizing much to my dismay that I had left it on the coffee table inside the cabin, along with a backpack containing my rifle ammunition. I watched as it turned its head toward the tree line, then proceeded to throw its head back and let loose an unearthly, ominous howl before it lowered its gaze back to me. I took in a deep breath and held it as I witnessed it lower its stance, knowing all too well what was about to transpire. It launched from its position at incredible speed, which caused me to throw myself backward into the truck and scramble to get the passenger side door shut. A split second later, it slammed into the door, which caused the inside panel to come loose and reveal the massive dent that it had just left. The dog then jumped up and put its paws on the window, looked in, and barked at me before it attempted to pull the handle with its teeth. Bewildered, I reached forward and slammed the locking pin down, which caused the shadow dog to cock its head, almost as if in confusion. It began to make its way around to the other side of my truck. I immediately knew that it was about to try to open the driver's side door, so I hurried and slammed the pin down on it as well. It began to pull at the handle with its teeth, then barked in frustration. The dog made its way around to the rear of my truck, jumped up into the bed, backed itself up against the tailgate, and lowered its stance. It threw itself against the back slider, which caused the glass to spiderweb and buckle. I placed my back against the dash and braced the glass with my feet in a last-ditch effort to prevent it from breaking through. The shadow dog backed up to the tailgate once again as it prepared itself for another attack, then launched itself against the glass. The force from the blow sent a wave of jarring pain up my legs that made me wail in agony. It backed up once more in preparation for another assault, then rocketed forward. Only this time, it veered to the side and met the glass to the right of my legs. It made it through. The back glass behind the driver's seat gave way. The shadow dog promptly stuck its massive head through the opening and began to thrash about, widening the hole. It grabbed a hold of my pants leg and began to drag me out of the truck through the gaping space. I fought as hard as I could. I grabbed onto the steering wheel, then onto the back of the seat in an attempt to save myself, but its strength completely overwhelmed me. It dragged me out of the truck, over the side rails of the bed, and then began to drag me toward the cabin. I thought for sure that I was done for, but it came to a complete stop, snapped its head to the tree line, and proceeded to growl. It took one quick look at me before it sprinted off into the woods. I knew that this may be my only chance at escape, so I collected myself from the ground and retrieved my rifle from the truck as swiftly as I could manage. The dog was nowhere to be seen, but I could faintly hear it barking and growling in the distance. The pain in my legs was nearly unbearable, but I forced myself to shamble toward the safety of the cabin. I had reached the halfway point between my truck to the door when I heard the rustling of brush. I spun around and reeled in terror as the dog re-emerged from the woods. It locked eyes with me, then proceeded to bark and trotted towards me. I pushed through the fear, through the pain, and made my way to the cabin as quickly as I could, rifle case in hand. Although my rifle wasn't loaded, in the worst-case scenario, I could at least strike the dog with it in self-defense. Thankfully, the shadow dog moved toward me at a much slower pace than it initially had when I was in the truck, so I was able to reach the open door of the cabin safely. I darted inside and immediately slammed the door, locking it behind me. I fully expected the dog to slam into it in an attempt to smash through, but it didn't. I placed the rifle case by the door and forced myself to look out the window to see what it was doing. The dog paced back and forth in front of the narrow porch, switching its gaze back and forth between myself and the tree line. What's it doing? I asked myself. It had been trying its damnedest to get me in the truck, but now it was just pacing, watching. It didn't rush the door, nor did it try to break through a window. It didn't even make a sound. It just marched, watching intently. I kept my eyes fixated on it through the window as best I could whilst retrieving my sidearm from the table and the rifle ammunition from my backpack. I placed my magnum on my hip and loaded the rifle to make sure that I was ready for the next assault. The shadow dog paced several more times before it made its way around the corner to the back side of the cabin. I made my way toward the back wall and watched for it through the window for some time, but it was nowhere to be seen. Then I heard a knock at the front door. A knock? A dog would scratch at the door, maybe even whine or bark. But knock? Although the chances were astronomically low, this could be a person lost in the woods who sought refuge. If it was, I had to get to them before the dog did. Hello? Who's there? I called out as I made my way across the cabin, but there was no response. I was met with only another series of knocks. Upon reaching the door, I called again. Hello? Help me. A faint, steady voice finally answered. I'm lost and tired and hungry. Please let me in. There's some sort of strange animal out here. It's after me. I unlocked the door and began to push it open. I managed a gap of only a few inches before something slammed against it, which sent me flailing backward onto the floor. I then heard the familiar growling and barking, followed by the sounds of tearing flesh and a blood-curdling screech. The dog had gotten to them first. The sounds began to retreat from my door. I assumed that the dog must be dragging them away into the woods, so I grabbed my rifle in hopes that I might be able to save them. I threw open the door only to find the shadow dog outside, alone, staring off into the trees. It turned back and looked at me, then began to bark wildly. Although I was bemused to find it alone with no sign of the other person, I wasted no time in pulling the door shut, then quickly slammed the bolt back into place. Again, I fully expected the dog to slam into the door after me, but it didn't. It only barked at me a few more times before it resumed pacing in the front of the porch. It continued this behavior for a while, then came up onto the porch and laid down. It fixed its gaze outward onto the tree line and began to emit a low, unsettling growl. I couldn't believe it. Its behavior was completely different from what it had initially displayed while I was outside. Still, I didn't trust this creature. It had attempted to harm me once before, and it very well may try to do so again. I was armed and ready, though I wasn't sure if firearms would affect it whatsoever. I watched it through the window for nearly the entire night, waiting for any change in its behavior. The shadow dog eventually stood up and paced again, fixated on the tree line. It stopped and looked back at me through the window, locked its eyes onto mine for a brief moment, and then made its way toward the woods, barking the entire way. I watched and waited, wondering if it was gone for good. It had been a few hours since the dog disappeared into the woods, and I hadn't heard so much as a peep after the barking faded into the distance. It was eerily silent once again until a set of red eyes appeared just inside the tree line, watching me. Admittedly, I was not only terrified, but also aggravated beyond all reason about my current situation and inconceivably tired. I was accustomed to being the hunter, not the prey, and I wasn't about to let that change. I refused to be stalked by this mutt. The sun would be rising any minute. I picked up my rifle and threw open the front door in anger, stepped outside, and called arrogantly into the waning night. "I've had enough." As I aimed my rifle toward the glowing eyes, I was met with the most sinister and horrific screeching sound imaginable, as if 1,000 banshees were wailing all at once. Ice ran through my veins and my hands trembled so intensely that I nearly dropped my firearm as a new monstrosity emerged from the tree line. It stood on 2 legs and was about the size of a person, bearing a gaunt form. It was hunched over, its long arms dangled toward the ground, ending in clawed hands. Its pale skin, dotted with deep teeth marks and gashes that seemed freshly healed, clung to its toned musculature. The sight sent a rush of disgust into my deepest bowels. It had piercing red eyes like the dog, but its presence was altogether different. It screeched once again, pulling back its pointed ears as it revealed its long, sharp fangs and flared its flat, upturned nostrils. It was at this moment I accepted, no matter how much I initially detested the thought, that I was the prey in this situation. I knew that I looked like a 7-course meal of this abomination. It lowered its stance and raised its arms out to the side with its claws spread wide. I readied my rifle, prepared to place as many shots as I could into it in an attempt to take it out, or at the very least slow it down so that I could retreat within the cabin. It began to close the distance between us at a blinding speed. I backpedaled slowly as I repeatedly fired and cocked my rifle as fast as I could. My shots seemed to be ineffective. They caused no real damage and failed to slow it down. The magazine in my rifle quickly became empty, so I threw it toward the creature. I drew my magnum from its holster and kept firing as I continued to move backward until the worst possible thing happened. I tripped. It had nearly reached me when all of a sudden, the shadow dog appeared out of the darkness. It slammed into the foul creature at full force, sending it spinning and bouncing across the ground until it managed to slam a clawed hand into the dirt and skid to a stop. The abomination screeched at the shadow dog and bared its fangs, but it didn't attempt to strike back at the dog whatsoever. It tried to come for me once again instead. I readied my magnum, but was met with a dull click when I attempted to fire. It was empty. The dog struck once again, but this time it found a firm hold upon the creature and refused to let go. They rolled around on the ground, each trying to get the upper hand on the other until the dog finally pinned it down. The sun then began to rise. The blinding rays caused the skin of the creature to boil and sizzle as it shrieked in pain, and it tried to escape the clutches of the shadow dog to no avail. Overwhelmed by the brilliance of the sun, the abomination's flesh gave way to bone before erupting in flames, and burned until nothing remained of the creature but ash. The dog howled in triumph as the sun began to unravel the shadows that consumed it, revealing a much smaller, less threatening form. I could now see the true form of the dog underneath. It was my best friend who had been killed trying to protect me many years ago. I couldn't believe my eyes. "Oh my God, that you, boy? I'm so happy to see you." I called to him, I was not only dumbfounded, but also elated to behold such a sight. He threw his body against mine and began to lick my face. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I'd never thought I'd see you again. My dog then proceeded to run away, disappearing around the back corner of the cabin. I sprang to my feet and followed him, but he had already vanished before I could catch up. I made my way over to the grave where my friend had been laid to rest all those years ago. Not only once, but twice now you've saved me from certain death. I spoke before kneeling at his headstone, recalling the time he had saved me from an angry black bear. I'd gotten too close to her cub and she charged me, but he threw himself between us in order to buy me enough time to escape. You gave your life for me once more and came back to save me again. You really are the bestest boy in the entire world. Tears continued to pour down my face as I spoke to him. I really can't thank you enough for everything. You deserved a much better, longer life. The wind picked up and blew the fallen leaves around. Your life may have been cut short, but that didn't stop you from watching out for me, did it? You've always been here and in my heart. I'll never forget you. As long as I live, I'll have no idea what would happen if that creature had gotten a hold of me. I wept. But you weren't about to let that happen, were you? I love you, boy. Afterward, I became obsessed with researching the incident, soaking up every last piece of information that I could find. The closest thing that I could come up with in regards to the abomination was that it was some sort of vampire. According to old folklore, they cannot come inside of your home without permission. They must be invited in or wait for you to venture out into the darkness on your own. The longer they go without feeding, the more feral and grotesque they become, which explains its appearance. I fully understand what my old canine companion was trying to do, ensure my safety by forcing me inside of the cabin, and prevent that creature from reaching me. I knew that he was fully aware of the danger that awaited me just outside the door, but what I still don't understand is how he managed to return in such a terrifying, brooding form, no less. I couldn't find anything to help shed some light on the phenomenon, not a single account where this had happened before. Still, and yet, he somehow returned from the grave to protect me. Perhaps the bond of friendship has simply proved itself stronger than even the grip of death. I've never been more thankful for anything in my entire life. Not only did my best friend save my life once again, but I also got to see him one last time. What more could you possibly ask for? People kept going missing from my town over the last couple of years. Their mangled remains were all that were ever found of them, if anything was found at all. And many thought that some sort of large predator was to blame. I guess that in the end, they weren't far off. But they may never know the whole truth. At least, I hope not. They eradicated a bulletin board at the edge of the woods and covered it with missing posters. Even though the passage of time had seen fit to erase them, much like the beast, the images still served a purpose, not only as a grim reminder of our vulnerability and mortality, but also as a warning of the danger that lurked beyond. However, the potential danger of entering the woods did nothing to deter many of our residents. They refused to live their lives in fear. Many of them were experienced woodsmen, so I can't say that I blame them for being confident, even if it was foolish. They believed that taking precautions and being armed would save them, no matter how nonsensical the sentiment was in contrast to the piling cases. In my experience, pride and arrogance rarely serve as anything more than a fast track to disaster. A few days ago, my best friend informed me that he would be going into the woods because he needed to retrieve his trail cameras. He had to work until late in the evening, so there was only a short window to get them before night set in. Although he protested, I refused to let him go alone as I couldn't bear the thought of him becoming the next victim. I didn't have any family left, and the one that remained, I never got to see. My father had disappeared many years ago, and my mother and grandparents were all long dead. I was closer to him than anyone else in this world. Though we should have made haste in collecting the cameras, we allowed time to slip away from us. The evening was spent drinking beer, goofing around, and getting distracted by even the most trivial things that we'd stumble upon along the trails. We let our worries fade away and focus on having fun, as we always did. But there's nothing more that I regret in this life than not rushing to get the job done before nightfall, as we planned.
This one was smashed to pieces too, just like the rest.
Only a few more left to check," Rick said to me as we walked back to our ATVs. "I didn't know you had so many, bro." I replied, crushing a beer can. "I like to know what's going on out here. Been hoping to get a pic of whatever it is that's been taking our folks too. Maybe one of the remaining cams will..." I stopped short. I heard something large moving through the woods. "Matt, you hear that?" Rick started. "Shh." I interrupted, then whispered, "Turn your light out and get down." "Okay, I'm hunkered down by my four-wheeler," Rick replied, then crouched down beside his ATV. We both turned off our lights and continued to listen. The sound grew closer and closer until it was almost right on top of us. We remained silent and motionless and tried to peer through the dense brush surrounding us, although our eyes hadn't yet fully adjusted to the dark. All of a sudden, we were overwhelmed by a putrid scent stronger than any I had ever smelled. It was eerily reminiscent of a corpse, but altogether different and much more intense. I looked over at Rick to find he was holding his nose. He then shot me a disgusted yet puzzled look. The noises ceased. I placed my hand upon my holster, undid the buckle, and slowly drew my .45 loaded with hollow points. Rick reached up and grabbed his shotgun from the rack on his ATV. Both of us were ready to defend ourselves and each other. Tensions were high as we continued to scan our immediate area. Everything remained still for a time, until a hulking mass burst out of the foliage and went straight for Rick. "Shit!" was all that he managed to yell before it tackled him. The force from the blow sent his ATV rolling off into the brush. This initial assault was promptly followed by the sound of ripping flesh and cracking bones. "Rick!" I screamed, then opened fire in the direction of the hulking silhouette. But my efforts were in vain. It paid no attention to me nor my barrage of bullets, and they seemed to have no effect on it. I needed to load a new magazine, but when I attempted to retrieve it from my belt, I dropped it. I clicked my flashlight back on so that I could find the magazine swiftly, but made the mistake of having it pointed toward Rick when the beam came to life. He lay on the ground, motionless. His arms were separated from his body. His abdomen was flayed open and his intestines and organs were strewn about. Enormous chunks of flesh were missing from him, appearing as if they had been bitten off. My stomach turned in revulsion and feelings of anger and sorrow began to consume me. But they were quickly replaced by a paralyzing fear when I brought the beam of light upward toward his attacker. It was humanoid, albeit nothing more than a cruel mockery of the human form. The beast was much taller than any man or ape could ever hope to be. It was hairless, lanky, and its gray skin was stretched tightly over the bones beneath. Its appearance resembled that of a skeleton covered in a thin layer of flesh. It looked back at me over its shoulder, then dropped a chunk of meat before turning to face me. Its eyes were solid white and sunken way back into the depths of its skull. The lips were tattered as if it had chewed them off, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. It sniffed the air, then stared back at me with those hideous white eyes. The creature tilted its head from side to side as it studied me, a look of perplexity beginning to show on its face. Then it pounced. And that's the last thing I remember before I woke up in the hospital. Once the initial grogginess began to wane, I tried to sit up, but was immediately overwhelmed by the searing pain that ran diagonally across my chest. My head began to pound intensely, and my abdomen felt like it was going to burst. I clenched my teeth and took in a sharp breath before I surrendered and laid back down. "Hey now, take her easy there, Matt." "Dad?" I responded, fighting the urge to sit up. "Yeah, son, it's me. Long time no see. Let me see you up," he said before I heard him get up and make his way over to me. He then grabbed the control for the hospital bed. "Where have you been all this time?" I asked as my upper half was elevated. "It's a long story. We'll get there," he replied, then laid the control back down and returned to his seat in the far corner of the room. I hadn't seen him for many years, and time hadn't been kind to him. The skin that I could see was covered in various types of scars. He had a shaggy beard, his hair had turned gray, and he had massive bags under his eyes. His appearance gave the impression that he hadn't slept in ages. He looked like a man who had seen and been through more than his fair share. What happened? Is Rick? I exclaimed as memories of the incident began to spring forth. "He's gone, son, and you're lucky to be alive." My eyes began to well up with tears. "Rick, no, that thing. There was some kind of creature Dad had killed." "Shh. Easy now. It's all right, boy. There was nothing you could have done. That thing is no natural beast." "Well," I began, "what kind of beast is it?" "Patience, son. We'll get to everything in time. Let's start from the attack." "Okay, then how did I end up here?" I asked him. "It slaughtered your friend, then started on you." He leaned back in the chair and crossed his ankle over his knee. "That's when I showed up to the rescue. You're lucky I got there when I did." I was taken aback. "You saved me?" "Yup." We sat in silence for a moment, staring at each other, neither knowing what to say. Then I finally spoke up. "What made you come back? How'd you know where to look?" I asked. "I know I'm not exactly an easy man to get a hold of," he said in a flat tone, masking his sarcasm. "Pfft, that's an understatement," I interrupted, my words carrying just a touch of aggravation. He ignored my commentary. "But I finally caught wind that something has been happening to the people here for quite some time. I had an inkling of what it was right away and rushed to get here." My father stared at me for a moment, then got out of the chair and walked towards the door of my hospital room. He slowly leaned his head through the doorway, looked left and right to see if the coast was clear, then quietly shut the door. Dad then promptly turned the deadbolt into place before returning to his seat. "Anyway, I got to town and started collecting information. That's when I learned that you two dummies went up on the trail. I knew nothing good was gonna come of it, so I took off after y'all. Got to you just in time." "So, you saw it?" "Yup, but it ain't the first time." I was puzzled by this. My father was always mysterious and cryptic, the few times that I did get to see him growing up. But for him to know that a creature like that exists and not say anything about it, it didn't add up. "I hit it several times with my .45 and didn't phase it. What did you do to get it off me?" I asked him. "Simple. I shoot it off with a torch and then hit it with a big old Molotov for good measure," he replied smugly. "Now, that ain't enough to kill it for good, mind you, but it was enough to drive it away so that I could pull you out of them woods and get you some help." "Then I guess I should thank you," I said, lowering my head to the side before looking back at him. "So, thanks, but still, what is that thing and where did it come from?" "I can't tell you what it's called. Saying it draws 'em. Talking about it is bad enough by itself," he answered before dropping his head for a moment, then looked back up at me with a solemn look on his face. "But I think it's time you know." My father then began to tell me the truth behind everything, the profound reality of his life story. "I was just a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, when my parents told me the good news. I was going to be a big brother. They left me with my grandmother while they went to their ultrasound appointment. My parents were bursting at the seams with joy when they came to pick me up. They then gave me the best news of my young life. My mother was carrying twins. I can't even begin to describe the glee that I felt at that moment. The prospect of finally having not only one, but 2 younger siblings filled me with unbridled excitement. I couldn't wait to meet them, teach them, protect them. Times were hard, money was scarce, but we were all ecstatic nonetheless. I wish I could say that my mother had a smooth pregnancy, but she was sick all the time. Barely ate anything and rarely acted like herself. Her doctor feared that the lack of nutrients would harm the twins. I wish we had known how right he was. As time went on, she became more irritable, more angry towards everyone. We didn't know whether it was the hunger, the pregnancy, or her sickness. All we knew was that something was terribly wrong. Regardless, we tried our best to care for her and make her happy. One day they came back from an ultrasound appointment in tears. They had me go to the other room so that they could speak with my grandmother in private about the situation. But I, being a kid, made it my mission to find out what the adults were talking about. I crept across Grandma's shag carpet, careful not to make a sound until I was finally within earshot of their conversation. Mom had lost one of the twins. The ultrasound showed that only one of them remained in her womb. She said that there was no bleeding nor signs of a miscarriage, and that her doctor said the gestational sac may have been absorbed by her body or perhaps by the remaining twin, although she was further along in her pregnancy than when this phenomenon typically occurs. I remember crying about the loss, but I was still happy that one of them was okay, and that I'd still get to be a big brother soon. I retreated into my play area and fiddled with my toys as I quietly sobbed to myself. When they were finished going over the sensitive information, my parents came to find me and gave me the edited version. Although one twin, quote, didn't make it, end quote, my remaining sibling would be a little brother. The closer that Mom got to her due date, the more her condition worsened. She progressively ate less and became more belligerent. Losing one of the twins didn't help much either, and neither Dad nor I knew how to console her, nor what to do for her. Sometimes even the smallest thing could set her off, so we walked on eggshells and minded our P's and Q's. My old man and I spent a lot of time out back in the shed, where he taught me how to tinker with, clean, and repair various things. I cherished the time we spent together during those days. Other than the day you were born, they are by far my favorite memories. One day, while we were out in the shed, we heard blood-curdling wails of agony emanating from our house. My father and I looked at each other in confusion for a split second. Then our eyes widened as we simultaneously realized that it was my mother. We dropped everything and took off sprinting toward the house, both of us calling for her. My father was the first one to reach the back door, throwing it open with such force that I thought it would smash through the kitchen wall. We tore through the house toward their bedroom, knocking over the furniture in our path in a mad scramble to reach her. Upon arriving at the bedroom door, my father grabbed a hold of the knob and put his shoulder into it, nearly ripping it from the hinges, and neither of us could believe what we saw. My mother lay sprawled across the bed, motionless. Her abdomen was split open, appearing as if something had forced its way out from the inside. The room had been overtaken by the stench of decay, as if something dead had been festering in the room for weeks. Crouched inside of the gaping hole was my baby brother. Although he looked nothing like a human infant, I knew right away it was him. His skin was gray like the flesh of a corpse, tightly stretched over a lanky skeleton. He was hunched over, rummaging through my mother's flesh and organs as he took bites from various chunks. My brother then realized that we were there, watching him in horrified disbelief. He stood up and turned around to look at us with those ungodly, pasty white eyes, and a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth that were littered with pieces of my mother. He turned his head upward and sniffed the air a few times before returning his gaze to us. The sight chilled us both to the core and admittedly caused me to wet my pants. My father came to his senses much quicker than I did and promptly reached for the baseball bat that leaned against their dresser. My little brother fell forward. He threw his gangly hands outward to catch himself, then entered into a doubled-over position as he arched his back. His spine began to pop and grow rapidly, followed by the rest of his skeleton. The skin pulled over his bones, stretched ever tighter to accommodate the growth, and we watched in disbelief as he doubled in size right before our very eyes. Once the process had finished, he looked up at us and emanated an ear-splitting screech, which sounded like a combination of a scream and a hiss. My father drew back the bat, fully prepared to strike, but before we could, my little brother leaped down to the floor and then launched himself through the closed window, smashing it into oblivion. My father held his stance in shock for a few moments before he crept over to the window, checking to see if the coast was clear. "Looks like it's gone. You alright, boy?" he asked me, then dropped the bat and embraced me for the last time. "Come sit outside. I gotta call the law." When the police arrived and saw the scene, they immediately arrested my father. They blamed him for my mother's death and claimed that he had disemboweled her before doing God knows what with my little brother. They wouldn't listen to anything he nor I had to say about the matter. They ruled him criminally insane and sent him to a mental hospital to live out the rest of his days, which wasn't very long. Unable to cope with what he had seen, on top of being blamed for the death of the love of his life, He was crushed by the weight and eventually committed suicide. They found a short note scrawled in blood on the walls of his room, which read, "Forgive me, son. I love you." So you're saying that the thing I saw I started before my father cut me off? That's right, Matt. It's your uncle. My father replied. I've spent my whole life learning about him and things like him ever since. All the time I've been away, I've been hunting. Hunting? I asked, both confused and curious. Yup, your uncle vanished from this area after the incident your papa and I witnessed. But now he's returned. My mind has been consumed with a desire to find him and put him down since that day. After many years and more than my fair share of experience, I finally know how. Now all of the visible wear and tear on his flesh made sense. I see. But why didn't you tell me any of this sooner? Why did you let me continue to believe that Papa was a lunatic who murdered Mama and that you had turned your back on me? And where did you learn how to fight these things? I wanted to protect you. I felt you were better off hating your Papa and me than knowing what's really out there. But now I ain't got much choice. He responded before addressing the rest of my inquiry. Your uncle ain't the only kind of abomination out there running around. I've been a little bit of everywhere, talking to folks who know the truth. Folks who learn from their predecessors and pass on the knowledge to people like me. It's a rabbit hole that goes back for millennia. Well, in that case, why haven't you taken care of my uncle yet? My father looked away for a moment, then leaned forward in his chair. He interlocked his fingers and brought them to his lips in contemplation. Well, to be perfectly honest, son, he dropped his head. I couldn't do it. I became irate, disgusted with his response. What do you mean you couldn't do it? Look at everything he's done. I know, boy. I know that I should be more than capable and willing, but in the end, he's still my baby brother. I loved him since before he was even born, and for some strange reason that I can't explain, I guess that fact alone was enough to prevent me from finishing the job. You're unbelievable, I barked at him. So what then? You're just going to let him continue to stalk our woods and kill people? Dad looked down at the floor in silence for a while before eventually bringing his gaze back to me. Of course not, because I'm going to teach you how to kill him. Once you've seen something like that, there ain't no going back to normal life anyways. I'm going to teach you everything I know. You can't be serious. Me? Why else would I be here explaining everything to you? If your friend Rick wasn't enough of a reason to get riled up, now you have another. I didn't know how to respond. In all honesty, my feeling of irritation towards Dad and his reluctance to end this when he had the chance nearly made me refuse and lash out at him in spite. But I then began to weigh those emotions against how I felt about all of the pain and devastation my uncle had wrought. My anger quickly turned into determination. He was absolutely right. I wanted to. No, I had to kill this beast. I'll do it, but not for you, old man. For Mama and Papa and for Rick. For every other life that bastard is cut short. My father cracked a smile and chuckled a little. He tried to hide the pride on his face as he spoke. That's my boy. We've got some time before you're healed up enough to start the physical training, so we may as well start with the basics. He reached down beside the chair and retrieved an old weathered backpack. He pulled open the zipper, reached inside, and brought forth 2 thick, leather-bound books. One was fresh, while the other was visibly tattered and worn. This, he started, then got up out of the chair and walked over to me. Everything I've seen, everything I know, is ours to share. He handed me the old one, then held up the fresh one. And this one is yours. Here's a pen. Start wherever you get the notion. Dad, my father cut me off. Start reading. There are plenty of things in there that you need to know before we move on. Okay. Thanks, Dad. I replied solemnly. My father turned away and headed for the door to my hospital room. opened it, then looked back at me before exiting. "I'm gonna leave you two for a little bit. I'll be back with something to eat." He lowered his head and turned back to the doorway. "And I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can understand and forgive me. Sorry about your mother." He stepped through the doorway and left before I could say a word. I flipped the cover of my father's book and began to read. This handwritten journal went into detail about his many horrific experiences with a plethora of beasts, which, until now, I had believed to exist only in nightmares. It was also rife with descriptions and statistics, abilities, weaknesses, and recounted how he had not only managed to track, but also slay a great number of them. This information instilled a newfound respect for my father within me, an appreciation for him that I never imagined I'd have in all my life. My father is a hardcore, seasoned hunter, and soon, I will be too. My name is Kelly Davis, and as I sit and write this, shivering, I can't help but fear that my name will be all that remains of me. I have no way of knowing if this notebook will survive me or ever be found, all things considered. However, I feel that writing down everything that has transpired within this mind will, at the very least, help shine some light on what has happened to us. My husband Shane and I have always shared a hobby that authority looks down upon: the exploration of abandoned buildings and places. We never seek to cause damage or anything of the sort, but it is still trespassing and punishable by law. We've had our fair share of scares with the police, but have never been arrested nor caught. One day, while hiking a few hours away from home, we stumbled upon an old abandoned mine. We both had experience in spelunking and knew, in theory, what potential dangers to look for in a mine. Growing up in WV, one of the things they drill into your head is to keep away from old abandoned mines, but we didn't even give it a second thought. We were young and invincible. We returned home and made plans to eventually come back and explore it. The day had finally come, and we were bursting at the seams with excitement. Eager to get on the road, we checked our gear and set out, eagerly chatting about what we could potentially find within. "I know we don't usually take keepsakes, but maybe we'll find something cool like an antique pop bottle or an old lunchbox with a perfectly preserved pepperoni roll." Jane jested.
You know, that would be cool.
I replied mockingly, rolling my eyes. "I could feel you doing that from here," he said, side-eyeing me.
Oh, babe, you know I'm just kidding. I love that kind of stuff.
"I know you do. We both do." He took my hand and kissed it. "We're almost there." It was still early in the morning when we arrived in the area. We parked our SUV, geared up, and set out along the path. 30 to 45 minutes later, we were straying from it into the woods toward the old abandoned mine. We finally arrived at the entrance, adorned with the usual "no trespassing" and "keep out" signs. Jane asked, "You sure you're ready for this? It's different from exploring a natural cave."
Of course I am. You're not scared and thinking of backing out now, are you?
I teased. "Haha, no way. I was born for this. Let's go." I switched on my headlamp and headed inside, oblivious of the fate that would befall me. The smell of earth, coal, and stale, musty air penetrated our nostrils as we trekked inward. The narrow ray of light beaming in through the entrance slowly faded into the distance behind us, now no more than a pinhole perforating the inky black. All of a sudden, an overwhelming feeling of dread began to take hold of me, and I started having second thoughts about delving deeper.
Shane, I have a bad feeling about this. Maybe we should turn back.
"Oh, what's that now? Getting scared after teasing me, are you?" He laughed in response.
I'm serious.
I was cut short, and that's the last thing I remember before my consciousness switched off like a light. I woke on the ground beside the rail tracks in the dark several hours later. My light had been switched off, my head was pounding, and I was disoriented. I couldn't remember where I was or how I had gotten to this point.
Shane.
I groaned, only to be met with silence. I attempted to open my eyes so that I could observe my surroundings, but one of them was sealed shut by something. After some considerable effort, I finally managed to sit up. I moved my hand upward toward my face and began to inspect my eyelid. There was some sort of dried, crusty substance holding it closed. I carefully picked at it until I was finally able to open my eye, and then switched on my headlamp so that I could inspect what I now held in my hand. Dried chunks of blood. I gasped, dropped the flakes, and then ran my hand up my forehead. There was a trail of dried blood. I traced my fingers along it until I came upon a gash, and winced as I was met with a stinging sensation followed by a wave of pain that washed over my cranium. This caused me to immediately pull my hand away.
What happened? Why didn't Shane?
I started before realizing I was alone.
Shane?
I surveyed my surroundings using my headlamp. He was nowhere to be found. I looked behind me, shocked to find that the pinhole of light had completely disappeared.
How long have I been out?
I questioned. I looked down at the ground on my left side and found a chunk of rock that appeared as if it had freshly broken away from the ceiling. It had dried blood on one of the corners.
Well, that explains what happened, I guess.
I said to myself. I removed my pack from my bag and began to rummage for my first aid supplies. I carefully cleaned the wound on my head, jerking back in pain with every dab of the gauze, then applied some antiseptic and a bandage. After closing my pack, I placed it in front of me and used it as a brace in an attempt to stand up. My legs were weak, but I managed to get to my feet, then quickly lost my balance. I stumbled towards the closet wall and leaned up against it. After a few minutes, I was able to catch my breath, and my legs were finally strong enough to support me.
Shane, where are you?
I called once again, as loudly as I could manage without feeling as if my head would explode. Silence.
Why would he leave me here alone? Maybe he went to get help.
I asked myself.
The entrance is close, but it's probably not a good idea to attempt to hike back through the woods at night, especially in this shape.
I glanced over and was startled to find that the light on my headlamp fell upon a pair of legs. Someone was standing in the darkness. I traced them upward and found the unmistakable form of Shane. He was standing with his back mostly toward me, angled slightly toward a turn deeper in the mine. His head drooped downward, his arms hung limply, and his headlamp was switched off.
Shane, why didn't you help me? Why haven't you answered me?
I screamed at him, which caused my head to be overtaken by a throbbing wave of pain. He didn't answer me. He didn't even react at all. He remained completely motionless. Anger welled up in me, and I began to march toward him. I was now about 30 feet away.
Shane, hello?
I called to him, but again, he gave me no response. Instead, he slowly walked away around the corner, into the dark. I was completely stunned, stopping dead in my tracks. This wasn't like him at all. Shane was always so attentive, always so concerned about my well-being and tending to even my smallest of ailments. But now, he seemed to show zero regard for me whatsoever. I started walking after him again, quickening my pace as much as I could while still being cautious and mindful of my surroundings. I rounded the corner where Shane had been standing, only to find a long stretch of blackness that went deeper into the mine. He had disappeared. The same feeling of dread that came over me before I was knocked unconscious began to overtake me once again, but I didn't care. My anger and concern over Shane's behavior fueled me enough to be able to push through and move onward. I continued, moving down the steady incline until I eventually came upon a fork in the tunnel. One path leveled out and continued onward in the same direction as the tracks, while the other trailed off to the left and descended at a steep angle.
Great, I wonder which way he went.
I thought to myself.
Kelly.
I heard a faint voice call to me from the descending path, reverberating off the walls.
Kelly.
It sounded like Shane, but had a tone of lethargy, and sounded almost hollow.
Shane?
I called back.
Kelly. Guess I'm going down.
I followed the path around twists and turns for the better part of an hour, calling out to Shane with no further response. The path now leveled out a little and began to narrow.
Kelly.
I heard the voice start again, now sounding much closer. My heart jumped with glee.
Shane, where are you?
Kelly, help me. Hurry.
I'm coming. Hang on, baby.
I picked up my pace, paying zero regard to the terrain or my footing.
Kelly.
His voice called out to me once more, causing me to break into a run without thinking. I kept my gaze fixated on the darkness ahead and eventually came to a sharp left turn in the tunnel.
Kelly.
I placed my left hand upon the wall, slingshotted myself around the bend, and was ready to go into a sprint, but my feet met with wet ground. I lost my balance, fell onto my backside, and slid down the steep incline that was hidden just out of view. I reached out for the walls, then turned over and dug my fingers into the mud in an attempt to stop myself, or at least slow my descent. It was all for naught. Onward and downward I went, accelerating all the way. I felt the temperature steadily climb as I descended. Eventually, the tight tunnel spat me out and sent me sliding across the now level ground for several feet. Still in shock, I took a moment to catch my breath before rising to my feet. This new cavern reeked of metal and rust so fiercely that I began to feel nauseated. I turned my headlamp toward the incline I had just slid down, and my stomach immediately dropped. The light illuminated the mud, now revealed to be a stained, deep crimson which glistened in the beam. My eyes widened as I realized that this could very well be blood. Shane's blood. I looked down at my clothes and found to no surprise that I was completely covered. I tried to fight it, but I quickly lost the battle. I braced myself against the closest wall with both hands. I doubled over and began to expel what little contents remained in my stomach. I staggered a few feet and dropped to the ground, placing my back against the wall with my head between my knees. I tried desperately to catch my breath in between dry heaves as I repeatedly spat upon the ground. After a few moments, I began to feel better and used my headlamp to scan my new surroundings. I found myself in a cavern that was spacious, wide open with a high ceiling, and it was much hotter than the rest of the mine I had been in thus far.
Kelly.
I snapped my head in the direction of the voice, startled to find a door on the far wall of the cave opposite the incline. But it wasn't there when I had looked before and was out of place here. It was a large, painted metal door with a push bar, like one you would see at the exit of a building. The bar was covered in fresh, bloody handprints, and the door felt eerily reminiscent, although I couldn't place where I had seen it before.
Kelly.
His voice was closer now, muffled by the door. He had to be just on the other side. I sprang to my feet, prepared to go and find Shane, no longer caring about the absurdity of the door nor why he was there. As I approached the door, my headlamp began to flicker. I tapped on it a few times in hopes that it would be enough to stabilize it. It seemed to work, so I continued my approach, all the while pushing through crippling anxiety until I reached the door. As I pushed it open, I saw a similar cavern on the other side. Upon stepping to the doorway, my headlamp began to flicker intensely and went out, rendering me blind in the pitch dark as the door slammed shut behind me. I began to panic and frantically remove my headlamp. I felt around for the power switch and moved it into the off position before opening the battery compartment. These were brand new high-capacity batteries, so they shouldn't be anywhere near dead. I rolled them around in their fittings in an attempt to get more life out of them, but then the worst possible thing happened. One of them popped out of place, and my heart sank as I heard it collide with the floor. I immediately crouched down and began feeling along the ground where the sound had emanated from, desperate to find it. I had no desire to be lost in the dark down here. My heart raced faster and faster, so intensely that I began to feel it in my throat, until my fingers finally stumbled upon the little cylinder that served as my lifeline. I grabbed onto it as tightly as I could, taking a moment to close my eyes and breathe a sigh of relief before I put it back into place. I closed the battery compartment, placed the headlamp back on my head, and flipped the switch back into the on position. The light came back to life, but it now revealed a new setting, altogether different from what I had seen before it went out. I now found myself standing in an abandoned building. I looked around, stupefied not only by the change in scenery, but also by the fact that this was down in the mine. The tile floor was missing sections, and what remained of it was scuffed up or covered with trash and debris. The walls were full of holes, gashes, and graffiti. The ceiling was falling in, electrical wiring and fluorescent lights hung down from the ceiling. Memories suddenly came rushing back to the forefront of my mind. I'd seen this room before. It was in an abandoned building that Shane and I had explored. It was almost the same, with the only difference being the windows that were now completely bricked up. The sight was one that I had repressed within the deepest reaches of my mind, one that I had tried my best to forget, yet here I was, reliving it, and turned around to try to get back through the door, but it was gone.
Kelly.
I heard Shane's voice call to me from across the room. I whipped around to face the direction that it came from, but found no one.
Do you remember, Kelly?
As much as I detested it, I did. I did remember. I could see a door on the far wall. It was my only way out, but I knew that reaching it meant that I had to walk past him. I began to make my way across the room, trying my best to remain silent and not look over to where we had found him.
Help me.
I heard a voice struggling to choke out, calling to me from beyond the partition. My heart raced and I began to weep as I walked past the wall, knowing all too well what I would see if my gaze faltered. But I couldn't help myself. I stopped and turned right toward him. The beam of my headlamp followed as I looked downward to his position on the floor. And there he was, just as I remembered from our early days of urban exploration. It was an elderly homeless man. He'd fallen through the floor above and was impaled on a piece of rebar. Blood had begun to pool around him as he attempted to free himself. The sight caused more memories to come flooding back.
Shane, we have to call an ambulance. We have to get help.
We can't. If we call, we'll get arrested for trespassing.
I can't believe you. This is no different than murder.
This ain't murder. We didn't do this. It's not our fault, babe. We didn't cause him to fall through the ceiling.
Shane.
Don't shame me. Look, he's screwed either way. It won't matter if we call or not. Let's get out of here.
And that's exactly what we did. We left him there to die. The guilt consumed me until my mind eventually blocked out all memory of what happened. Yet here I was, face to face with him again.
Kelly, you left him there to die. You killed him.
I heard an ominous voice whisper into my ear, just over my shoulder. It wasn't Shane's voice. I spun around to face whoever it was, only to find that no one was there.
Why won't you help me?
I heard the homeless man ask me. I turned back around, and what I witnessed nearly made me collapse from shock. The homeless man was holding his head upright, his eyes locked onto mine. There was no white in his eyes at all. They were completely overtaken by the same inky blackness that permeated the mine. He smiled and laughed at me before he reached under himself and grabbed a hold of the rebar. He began to lift himself, and blood spewed from the wound with every inch that passed through him. My ears were filled with the sickening sound of metal being pulled through flesh. He freed himself of the rebar and lurched forward before eventually bringing himself upright, and said,
"Your turn, Kelly,"
with the same ominous voice that had whispered into my ear. I screamed at the top of my lungs before I turned left and made a mad dash toward the door opposite where I had entered. I shoved the push bar with all my might, which sent the door smashing into the wall outside of the frame with a sharp smack. I turned around and slammed it shut, then placed my back against it and lowered my stance in an attempt to brace the door and keep the man from pushing it open. But he didn't try to.
"There's nowhere left for you to run down here. You can't escape your fate,"
he called to me. Still, I didn't dare budge and remained in that position for some time before I finally stood up and stepped away from the door. When I turned back to look at it, it had vanished like the previous one, leaving only a solid cave wall where it once was. I collapsed to the ground, sobbing.
I'm so sorry. I wanted to help you. I did. Please, forgive me.
I let all of the overwhelming emotion, pain, and tears gush out of me for a long while before I eventually came back to my senses and pulled myself together. I then realized that the heat within this cavern was even more intense, enough to make me sweat. Luckily, I had packed some food and water for excursion. I removed my pack and began to search the front pocket for one of the bottles of water I had packed, sifting through protein bars until I eventually found one. After the trek, vomit, tears, and the heat, I needed to make sure that I was staying hydrated. I heard the shuffling of feet behind me and turned toward the noise, only to find none other than Shane. He stood further down the tunnel in the darkness, right at the edge of the beam from my headlamp. His head still hung so low that I couldn't see his face, but I finally started to realize that this wasn't my Shane.
What's going on here? What was that back there? How did...
I began to scream toward him, but he remained silent. He turned and slowly disappeared into the darkness. I threw the bottle of water back into the pocket, slung my pack around my shoulders, and took off after him. There was no way back, so I had no choice but to press onwards. The cavern narrowed into another corridor, and as I suspected, Shane had already vanished. I followed the winding and twisting path for perhaps another half an hour before it finally gave way to a straight. Standing at the far end, just past the edge of my light, was Shane. I stopped dead in my tracks, but didn't bother speaking as I knew I wouldn't receive a response. He stood silently as he had every other time I had seen him, but this time he did something different. He slowly raised his right arm and pointed at me. I didn't understand why he was doing this until I heard shuffling behind me and turned around. There was the homeless man, staring into the depths of my soul with those midnight eyes. His lips curled into a sneer and he began to laugh before breaking into a sprint towards me. My fight or flight instinct immediately took over, and before I could even process what was happening, I was running as fast as I could in the other direction, into the unknown, and Shane had already disappeared once again. I kept my pace until I reached a shift in the tunnel where it began to spiral downward to the left, forcing me to slow down in order to take the turn safely. As I descended, the temperature began to soar even higher. This, coupled with the sprinting for my life, caused me to break into an intense sweat. I began to rapidly dehydrate and my mouth felt like a desert. I had no other choice than to keep pushing onward, but I began to run out of steam. The homeless man's footsteps steadily grew louder. He was gaining on me. Down and down I went, moving as quickly as I possibly could, until the spiraling path came to an abrupt end and I smashed into a rock wall. I fell backward onto the ground, dazed. I tried my best to regain my bearings so that I could look for an escape route until I eventually found it. A narrow opening beneath the wall I had just slammed into, which was just big enough for me to crawl through on my hands and knees. The footsteps grew louder. He was nearly caught up with me now. I sat up, lunged forward, and scrambled into the opening. I had made it several feet inside when I heard scraping and dragging sounds behind me. I foolishly turned and looked back to find that the man was crawling behind me, laughing as he dragged himself into the opening. I shrieked and began moving forward once again, then something burst through the wall of the tunnel. A hand. The skin looked desiccated and decayed, like a dried-out corpse that had long been interred within the earth, and it tried to grab me. I pulled away and kept crawling forward, only to be met with a second hand bursting through the rock, then another, and another, until the path ahead was full of them, all trying their best to grab onto me and hold me in place. I fought and struggled against them with everything I had. I tried my best to keep moving forward, and the man kept gaining on me, but it was all too much. My injury and the heat, as well as being exhausted from the trek, running, and all I had experienced finally got the better of me. I collapsed. I turned over before the arms that surrounded me finally found their hold upon me. They pinned me to the ground, and I watched with primal terror as the man began to crawl up my legs. And that's the last thing I remember before I woke up here in this new cavern. There are no openings of any kind leading forward. I'm completely closed in. It's also freezing in here. I decided to use this newfound calm as an opportunity to not only add some layers, but also rehydrate and eat, hoping that it may help my body fight the cold. I removed my pack and sat down against one of the walls. I unzipped the main pocket, then quickly pulled out my extra clothes and put them on before moving toward my supplies. I opened the front pocket and removed one of my protein bars. It felt soft, so I just assumed that I had crushed it when I fell or while I was crawling through the tunnel. I opened the pack and proceeded to dump the crumbs into my mouth, expecting the sweet flavor of chocolate, only to be met with the taste of smoke. I immediately began to choke and spit in revulsion, both confused and appalled about the unexpected sensation. I then poured it into my hand and watched in disbelief as ash flowed into my palm. My eyes began to fill with tears, but I tried not to think about it as I reached back into the front pocket for a bottle of water, and my heart dropped as I pulled out empty bottles. I slumped against the wall and began to sob as my body went limp in defeat. I no longer had any hope of finding Shane, nor of leaving this place alive. I sat staring off into the distance, watching my breath rise into the beam of my headlamp and then dissipate into nothingness, until I eventually ceased crying. I began to think about everything that had transpired, and eventually it occurred to me that I should write all of this down in my notebook, not only to leave some record of what had happened to me behind in case I didn't make it, but also in an attempt to make some sense of it all. I know that the Shane who's been leading me deeper into this mine isn't my husband. That much is obvious. So who or what is he? And where is the real Shane? Considering everything unusual that has happened, I'm not sure any of this is even real. For all I know, I could still be unconscious, lying at the entrance of the mine, and this is all a bad dream. Perhaps I'm hallucinating from fume inhalation, which is a real possibility in a mine. But if this is real, then why was I forced to face the man we had left to die? Will I be forced to face every bad thing I've ever done down here? Or is this the end for me? Well, I guess I won't have time to ponder it any further at the moment. The wall opposite me has shifted and split, creating a new opening. I have no desire to get up and investigate or continue my journey, so I've just been watching for anything new to happen or for something to emerge from it. My headlamp just began flickering again and will probably go dead soon. The figure masquerading as Shane has just emerged from the opening and is motioning for me to follow it. What choice do I have? I can either wait to die here or continue onward to see what awaits me. Or maybe even find a way out. I'll write more later if I get the chance. If I don't, then I guess this is goodbye. I love you, Shane. Signed, Kelly Davis.